It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when I decided to work in the garage. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting a warm orange hue across the yard. I had always found solace in the garage, a space away from everything where I could tinker with tools and clear my mind. As I pulled out my old tool set, I heard footsteps approaching. It was soft, almost hesitant, and when I turned around, there stood my sister-in-law, Emma. She was holding a cup of coffee, her eyes reflecting the soft evening light. "Hey," she said softly, stepping inside. "I thought you could use a break." I smiled, grateful for the gesture. Emma and I had always been close, especially after my brother had passed away 2 years ago. There was something comforting about her presence, a quiet understanding that we both shared. "Thanks," I replied, wiping the grease from my hands before accepting the cup. Our fingers brushed lightly as she handed it to me, and for a brief moment, something flickered between us. It was subtle, so quick I almost missed it, but it was there, a spark of something unspoken. She stood there for a moment longer than usual, her gaze lingering on me. "You know," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "this was always Matt's favorite spot too." Her mention of my brother hit me like a wave, and I found myself struggling for words. "Yeah, he always loved messing around with old cars," I said, the memories of our childhood flooding back. But there was something different in the air today, something neither of us could ignore. Emma sighed, leaning against the workbench, her eyes distant. "I miss him," she confessed, her voice heavy with emotion. "I know," I replied, stepping closer to her. "I do too." The garage was quiet, save for the distant chirping of birds outside. We stood there, close enough to feel each other's presence, but far enough to maintain that unspoken boundary that had always existed between us. Yet, today, that boundary felt fragile, as if the weight of everything we had been through had finally pushed it to the brink. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick with tension that had been building slowly over the past few months, but had never been acknowledged. It was in the way she looked at me now, her gaze soft and searching, as if she was trying to find something in me that she had lost. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she whispered suddenly, her voice trembling slightly. I reached out instinctively, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to think about that," I said softly. "I'm here, Emma. I'll always be here." Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw a vulnerability in her that she had never shown before. She looked away quickly, her face flushing with emotion. "I'm sorry," she said, shaking her head. "I didn't mean to." "You don't have to apologize," I interrupted, my hand still resting on her shoulder. The warmth of her skin beneath my palm sent a shiver through me, and I realized then just how close we had gotten. Our proximity was dangerous, I knew that. But there was something magnetic about the moment, something neither of us could control. It was as if the years of grief and shared history had finally culminated into a moment that neither of us had expected, but both of us seemed unable to stop. Emma took a shaky breath, her gaze dropping to the ground. "I feel like I've been holding everything together for so long," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing it." I didn't know what to say. All I knew was that the connection between us, whatever it was growing stronger with each passing second. I could feel it in the way her body leaned ever so slightly toward mine, in the way her breath hitched when I brushed my thumb against her shoulder. I knew I should step back. I knew I should put distance between us before we crossed a line that couldn't be undone. But instead, I found myself moving closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "Emma," I whispered, my voice strained with emotion, "you don't have to do it alone." She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with something raw, something I couldn't quite place. For a moment, time seemed to stop, and all I could see was her. The way her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say something but couldn't, the way her body trembled ever so slightly beneath my touch. And then, before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us, my hand slipping from her shoulder to the small of her back, pulling her closer. Our breaths mingled in the space between us, and for a brief, fleeting second, I thought she might pull away. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned into me, her head resting against my chest as a soft, almost imperceptible sigh escaped her lips. The moment was fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on us, the unspoken emotions, the shared grief, the undeniable attraction that had simmered just beneath the surface for so long. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension. But words felt inadequate, useless in the face of what we were both feeling. So I remained silent, my hand gently tracing circles on her back as we stood there, caught in a moment that neither of us fully understood, but both of us were powerless to resist. We stood there, wrapped in the stillness of the garage, the air around us heavy with the unspoken. I could feel Emma's heartbeat against my chest, a steady rhythm that matched my own. Every inch of her body seemed to mold perfectly into mine, and I found myself wondering how we had gotten to this point. How had a simple moment of comfort turned into something so charged, so dangerously close to crossing that invisible line? I pulled back slightly, just enough to look down at her. Her eyes, usually so guarded, were wide and filled with a mixture of confusion and something else, something darker, something I couldn't name but felt deep in my bones. I knew she was wrestling with it too, the same thoughts spinning through her mind as mine. How wrong this was. How right it felt. "Emma," I whispered, my voice thick with emotions I could barely contain. I wanted to say something to calm the storm that was brewing between us, to ease the tension that had wrapped itself around our shared grief and mutual loss. But as soon as her name left my lips, she shook her head, almost as if she was telling me to stop, to not ruin whatever this was becoming. She took a small step back, breaking our physical connection, but the intensity of the moment lingered between us. Her gaze faltered, and I could see the internal battle raging within her. Her hand reached up, nervously tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so familiar, so achingly intimate, that it only deepened the pull I felt toward her. "I shouldn't be here," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I shouldn't have come in." I shook my head, taking a step forward, not wanting her to leave just yet. "Emma, it's okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though the tension coursing through me was almost unbearable. "You're not doing anything wrong." Her eyes snapped up to meet mine, and I could see the doubt and confusion swimming in their depths. "But I am," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't know what I'm doing, but it feels like I'm betraying him." The mention of my brother hung heavy in the air between us, a reminder of the boundaries we were supposed to respect, the lines we should never have blurred. And yet, despite the guilt that gnawed at my conscience, I couldn't bring myself to regret the way my heart raced whenever she was near, the way her presence seemed to fill a void inside me that had been left gaping after Matt's death. "You're not betraying him," I said quietly, stepping closer again, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her body. "We both loved him. We both miss him. But that doesn't mean we can't." She cut me off with a sharp intake of breath, shaking her head as if she couldn't bear to hear the rest of my sentence. "No," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "It's not that simple." For a moment, we stood there, the silence between us more deafening than any words could have been. My mind raced, searching for something to say that would make sense of the mess we were in. But before I could speak, Emma took a step forward, closing the gap between us once more. Her hand came up to rest gently against my chest, her touch so light it was almost imperceptible. But the effect it had on me was anything but. My breath hitched in my throat, and I could feel the heat of her palm through the thin fabric of my shirt, branding me in a way that sent shivers down my spine. "I don't know what this is," she whispered, her voice so quiet I had to strain to hear her. "I don't know what's happening between us." Neither did I. All I knew was that standing this close to her, feeling her touch, was igniting something inside me that I hadn't felt in a long time, something raw, something primal, something that I knew was dangerous but couldn't resist. "Emma," I murmured, my hand moving up to cover hers where it rested against my chest. "You don't have to figure it out right now. We don't have to figure it out right now." Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for a moment, the tension between us reached its breaking point. Her lips parted slightly, and I could see the indecision warring in her mind, the same conflict that had been gnawing at me for weeks. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, she leaned in. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, as if we were both testing the waters, unsure of where this would lead. Her lips brushed against mine, tentative and featherlight, but the contact sent a shockwave through me. Every nerve in my body seemed to come alive, and before I could think, I was kissing her back. It was slow, deliberate, the kind of kiss that held more weight than either of us was prepared to acknowledge. My hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer as our lips moved together in a rhythm that felt both familiar and foreign. I could taste the salt of her tears on my tongue, and the realization that she was crying only deepened the knot of emotion in my chest. We broke apart, both of us breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other as we struggled to process what had just happened. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know why." "Don't," I interrupted gently, my thumb brushing against her cheek. "Don't apologize." She pulled back slightly, her eyes searching mine, as if she was trying to find something that would make this all make sense. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer for her. All I knew was that we had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But as I looked into her eyes, I realized that despite the guilt and confusion swirling inside me, I didn't regret it. "Let's not think about it right now," I whispered, my hand gently cradling the back of her neck. "We'll figure it out later. Right now, let's just be." She nodded, though the uncertainty in her eyes hadn't fully disappeared. But she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into me again, her lips finding mine in another soft, lingering kiss. It was a kiss filled with all the emotions we had been holding back for so long: grief, longing, desire, and it felt like the only thing in the world that made sense. As the kiss deepened, the tension between us shifted, becoming something more urgent, more intense. My hands roamed her back, feeling the curve of her body beneath my fingertips, and I could sense the same need building in her. But even as we lost ourselves in each other, I knew that this was only the beginning. As the kiss deepened, it was as if the floodgates had opened, and all the emotions we had buried, all the unsaid words, came rushing out in that single moment. Emma's hands slid up my chest and found their way around my neck, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. The warmth of her body pressed against mine felt like a balm to wounds I hadn't even realized were there. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist, and all that mattered was the way her lips moved against mine, soft and searching. But the longer we kissed, the more urgent it became. My hand slid down to the small of her back, pulling her even closer, while the other found its way to her face, cupping her cheek as if to hold her in place, to make sure this moment didn't slip away. I could feel her breathing quicken, her chest rising and falling against mine, and I knew she was feeling the same pull, the same undeniable need to let go of everything that had held us back. When we finally pulled away, both of us were breathless, our foreheads still pressed together. I could feel the weight of what had just happened settling over us, and for the first time, it truly hit me. We had crossed the line, the one that had always seemed so clear, so impenetrable. And now, there was no going back. Emma opened her eyes slowly, and when her gaze met mine, I saw the same mixture of guilt and desire reflected back at me. Her hands dropped from my neck, and she took a small step back, her breathing still uneven. "This is crazy," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We shouldn't be doing this." I knew she was right. This was wrong. So many lines had been blurred, so many boundaries crossed. But as I stood there, looking at her, all I could think about was how right it had felt, how much I wanted her despite everything. "I know," I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. "But it's not just you. I feel it too, Emma." Her eyes flickered with uncertainty, and I could see the conflict written all over her face. She wrapped her arms around herself as if to shield herself from the intensity of the moment. "I don't know how we got here," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how this happened." I took a step toward her, hesitant but unable to stay away. It happened because we've both been through so much, I said, trying to make sense of it myself. We've both lost so much. And maybe we've just been looking for something to hold on to. Her gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, I thought she was going to leave, to walk away and put an end to this before it spiraled further out of control. But then, she looked up at me, and the vulnerability in her eyes made my heart ache. I don't know what to do, she admitted, her voice breaking. I don't know how to stop this. I reached out, my hand hovering just above her arm, unsure if I should touch her again. Maybe we don't have to stop, I said gently. Maybe we just take it slow. Figure it out as we go. She looked up at me, and I could see the tears welling in her eyes. What about everything else? She asked, her voice trembling. What about what this means? What about Matt? The mention of my brother's name sent a pang of guilt through me, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I could do this, if we could do this. But then I remembered how lonely the past 2 years had been, how much I had missed having someone to confide in, someone to care for. And it wasn't just about the physical attraction between us, though that was undeniable. It was about the connection, the shared grief, the way we understood each other in a way that no one else could. Matt's gone, I said softly, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. But that doesn't mean we have to keep punishing ourselves for it. He wouldn't want that. Her eyes searched mine, as if she was looking for some kind of reassurance, some kind of permission to let herself feel what she was feeling. You really think he wouldn't hate us for this? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I shook my head, though the doubt still gnawed at the edges of my conscience. I think he'd want us to be happy, I said, though the words felt heavy in my chest. I think he'd want us to move on. Emma let out a shaky breath, and for a moment, she just stood there, staring at me as if trying to make up her mind. And then, slowly, she closed the distance between us again, her arms wrapping around my waist as she rested her head against my chest. I'm scared, she whispered, her voice muffled against my shirt. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close, and rested my chin on top of her head. I'm scared too, I admitted, my voice soft. But we'll figure it out. Together. For a long time, we just stood there in the garage, wrapped in each other's arms, the weight of everything we had lost and everything we were risking hanging in the air around us. I could feel her body relax against mine, and the tension that had been building between us for months seemed to ease, if only for a moment. But even as we stood there, I knew this was only the beginning. The feelings we had stirred up couldn't be undone, and the path we had chosen was anything but simple. There would be consequences, and the guilt we felt wasn't something that would just disappear overnight. But for now, we had each other, and that was enough. Slowly, Emma pulled back, her hands resting on my chest as she looked up at me with tear-filled eyes. We can't do this here, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, understanding what she meant. The garage, filled with memories of Matt, wasn't the place for this, for us. Come with me, I said, taking her hand gently in mine. She hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, allowing me to lead her toward the house. The walk was short, but every step felt heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. Inside, the air was still and quiet, the house dark except for the faint light filtering through the curtains. I turned to her as we reached the living room, my hand still holding hers. We don't have to rush this, I said softly, my thumb brushing over her knuckles. We don't have to do anything we're not ready for. Emma looked up at me, and for a moment, her expression was unreadable. But then, slowly, she stepped closer, her free hand reaching up to cut my cheek as she leaned in and kissed me again. This kiss was different, deeper, more deliberate. There was no hesitation now, no lingering doubt. Her lips moved against mine with a need that matched my own, and I could feel the heat between us building with every passing second. I pulled her closer, my hands sliding down her back as I deepened the kiss. Her body pressed against mine, and I could feel the tension in her muscles, the way her breath hitched as our lips moved together in a slow, sensual rhythm. But even as we lost ourselves in the kiss, I knew this was only the beginning. There was still so much left unspoken, so much we hadn't yet faced. As the kiss deepened, everything around us seemed to fade. The quiet ticking of the clock on the wall, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the lingering shadows of the house, all of it disappeared, leaving only the sound of our breathing and the feeling of her body pressed against mine. Emma's hands slid up my back, her fingers threading through my hair as she pulled me closer, as if the space between us was still too much to bear. My hands moved on their own, tracing the curve of her waist and the small of her back, feeling the soft warmth of her skin through the fabric of her shirt. Every touch seemed to intensify the need between us, and I could feel the tension rising, the restraint we'd clung to for so long slipping away bit by bit. We broke the kiss only to catch our breath, our foreheads resting against each other's as we struggled to make sense of what is happening. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her lips still parted as if she was trying to find the words, but none came. I pulled back slightly, just enough to look at her, to search her face for some sign of hesitation. Her eyes were dark with emotion, filled with the same confusion and desire that I felt coursing through my veins. And yet, in that moment, neither of us could stop. Neither of us wanted to. "Are you sure?" I whispered, my voice low and strained. It was a question I wasn't even sure I wanted the answer to, but I had to ask. For a long moment, Emma didn't respond. Her eyes flickered between mine, her breathing still uneven as she stood there, weighing the consequences of what was happening. But then, slowly, she nodded, her fingers tightening in my hair as she leaned in to kiss me again. This time, the kiss was different, deeper, more urgent, as if all the weeks of tension and unresolved emotions were finally boiling over. Her hands slid down my chest, her fingers trembling slightly as they fumbled with the buttons of my shirt, and I knew then that this was it. We had crossed the line, and there was no turning back. I pulled her closer, my hands finding their way beneath her shirt, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath my fingertips. Her breath hitched at the contact, and I could feel her body responding to every touch, every kiss, as if we were both being consumed by something far bigger than either of us could control. We stumbled toward the couch, our lips never breaking contact, and when we finally fell onto the cushions, it was as if the last of our restraint disappeared. Her body pressed against mine, soft and warm and so familiar, yet so completely new, and I found myself lost in the sensation of it all. Her hands roamed over me, hesitant at first, but then more confident, more assured as she explored every inch of me. And as her fingers traced the lines of my chest, my arms, my back, I felt something stir inside me, a longing, a need that I hadn't realized I'd been suppressing for so long. I wanted her, not just in the physical sense, though that was undeniable. I wanted everything. The way she made me feel, the way she looked at me with those dark, searching eyes, the way her touch sent shivers down my spine. I wanted her in a way that went beyond the surface, beyond the simple attraction that had drawn us together. I wanted the connection, the understanding, the shared history that had brought us to this point. My lips moved from her mouth to her neck, trailing soft kisses along her skin, and I felt her arch beneath me, a soft sigh escaping her lips as her hands tightened on my shoulders. The sound of it, the way she reacted to every touch, every kiss, was intoxicating, and I couldn't get enough. I wanted to hear more, to feel more, to lose myself in her completely. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible as her hands slid down my back. "Don't stop." Her words ignited something inside me, something primal and raw, and I knew then that there was no stopping, no going back. We had been dancing around this for so long, and now that we had finally crossed that line, there was no turning away from it. I kissed her again, harder this time, my hands slipping beneath her shirt, pulling it up and over her head in one swift motion. The sight of her, vulnerable and open before me, made my heart race, and for a moment, I just stood there, staring at her, trying to commit every detail to memory. Her hands moved to my shirt, pulling it off with the same urgency, and when our skin finally met, it was as if a spark ignited between us. The heat of her body against mine, the way her fingers traced the lines of my chest, my back, it was almost too much to bear, and yet I couldn't get enough. We tumbled back onto the couch, our bodies moving together in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Every touch, every kiss felt like it carried the weight of everything we had been holding back for so long, and the more we gave into it, the more intense it became. Her hands gripped my arms, her nails digging into my skin as our movements became more urgent, more frantic. I could feel the tension building, the heat between us growing until it felt like we might both combust from the sheer intensity of it. And as we moved together, as our bodies found their rhythm, I knew that we had crossed a line that could never be undone. When it was over, we lay there together, tangled in each other's arms, our breathing still uneven as we tried to make sense of what had just happened. The room was quiet, save for the sound of our hearts pounding in unison, and for a long time, neither of us said anything. I held her close, my hand gently tracing patterns on her back, and I could feel the weight of it all settling over us, the consequences, the guilt, the uncertainty. But even as the reality of what we had done began to sink in, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. Emma stirred beside me, her head resting on my chest as she whispered, "What now?" I didn't have an answer for her. I didn't know what came next, what this meant for us, for everything. All I knew was that we had crossed a line, and there was no going back. But as I looked down at her, at the way her fingers traced lazy circles on my chest, I knew that whatever happened, whatever came next, we would face it together. For now, that was enough. As the silence settled between us, the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. The warmth of Emma's body against mine was comforting, but beneath it all, there was a quiet tension. The line we'd crossed was impossible to ignore, even if we both wanted to. I gently ran my fingers through her hair, feeling her breath steady as she lay on my chest. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped, like we could remain in this quiet, stolen moment forever. But I knew better. The truth was, nothing about this was simple. Emma stirred, lifting her head to meet my gaze. Her expression was soft but conflicted, a mixture of tenderness and uncertainty. I could see the thoughts running through her mind, the same thoughts that were running through mine. What had we done? What would this mean? Could we even go back to the way things were? "We can't stay here forever," she whispered, her voice fragile as if speaking the words aloud would shatter the fragile peace we created. "We have to face it." I nodded, though the thought of leaving this moment behind was unbearable. "I know," I replied softly, my hand trailing down her back. "But I don't want to think about anything else right now." She smiled faintly, but there was no mistaking the sadness in her eyes. "Neither do I," she admitted, her fingers brushing lightly against my chest. "But what happens when we do? What do we do then?" I didn't have an answer for her. Every possibility seemed too complicated, too uncertain. We'd crossed a line that could never be undone, and the path ahead was full of guilt, confusion, and the knowledge that what we had done wasn't just wrong, it was irreversible. "We'll figure it out," I said, though my voice lacked the conviction I wished it had. "We don't have to know everything right now." She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her as she looked down at me. Her eyes, so full of emotion, flickered with the same question that had been gnawing at me since the moment we kissed. "But what if we can't figure it out? What if this was a mistake?" The word hung in the air between us, heavier than anything we'd said so far. A mistake. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of it settle in my chest. I knew there was truth to it. We had broken something, shattered the boundary that had once been so clear between us. But the thought of calling it a mistake, of pretending this moment hadn't happened, felt like a different kind of betrayal. "I don't think it was a mistake," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't say it was wrong to want to be with you, to want to feel something again." Her gaze softened, but the uncertainty didn't leave her face. "I don't know if I can live with this," she said, her voice trembling. "The guilt, the fear of what people will say, the shame. I don't know if I'm strong enough." The vulnerability in her voice broke something inside me. I sat up, reaching for her hand, holding it tightly as I tried to find the right words. "Emma, you're not alone in this. I'm here. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. I don't know what the future looks like, but I know that what we shared, it wasn't just a moment. It meant something. Tears welled in her eyes as she squeezed my hand, but the doubt was still there, lingering just beneath the surface. I don't know, she said again, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know if I can handle it. We sat there in silence for a long time, the enormity of what we'd done pressing down on us from every angle. The questions, the guilt, the uncertainty, they all weighed heavily on us, pulling us back to reality. Finally, Emma pulled away slightly, her eyes locking with mine. I need time, she said softly. I need to think. I nodded, even though the thought of her leaving filled me with a sense of dread. Take as much time as you need, I said, though my heart was aching at the thought of what that meant.